especially at such an incredible time. I mean, uh, in my lifetime, there's been nothing like it, and I'm not that young, right? Um, Even before what's happened in the last half a year, when I would talk about eco-dharma, I would often, emphasize that when you really understood, if you really understand the situation today, ecologically, not just about climate change, or climate emergency, but the larger ecological, in terms of extinction events, many different types of pollution, plastics, overpopulation, et cetera, et cetera. If you put all that together, uh, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that um, the now global civilization that we have achieved seems to be self-destructing, and this seems to be the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced. That's what I was saying. And now, I mean, we just had this cascade of crises, and to be frank, there's no guarantee that they are over by any means, right? I mean, first of all, the pandemic exposing the fact that, well, first of all, in sort of incompetent and corrupt government, but also a really inadequate healthcare system. In fact, I feel uncomfortable calling it a healthcare system. I think it's better understood as a healthcare industry. The difference being, with an industry, the point is for making money, as opposed to a system, which is the main focus is for helping people be healthy and retain their health. And then we've had the economic side to it, and not just a temporary pause, but what may well be the beginning of a much longer and deeper kind of economic collapse. Again, revealing a long-standing problem, the fact that our economic system really hasn't been working for most people, that it's been focused on sort of helping billionaires make more money, and this already obscene and still growing gap between rich and poor. And then now, just in the last couple of weeks, the whole issue of anti-racism and Black Lives Matter has exploded. And a lot of these problems aren't new. It's just that the situation has come together in a way to aggravate them and to make them all that much more apparent, right? It's not as though what we're looking for, that what we would want is a return to the old normal, which for most people wasn't very nice to begin with. So, when I think about this situation, it seems to me challenging, difficult, dangerous, but also hopeful in a way, in terms of maybe some of the possibilities that are embedded within it. I'm reminded of one of my favorite Zen koans, where the student asks the master, what's the constant activity of all the bodhisattvas and mahasattvas? In other words, what are awakened people doing all the time? And the reply, of course, is very short and simple, to the point, responding appropriately. And that's what we learn through our practice, right? Our practice isn't about transcending the world in some way, but rather being more fully in it so that we can respond appropriately to the situations that present themselves. How do we possibly respond appropriately to the situation we find ourselves within today? And of course, the big question for us is, what is it about the Buddhist tradition in general, and the Zen one in particular, that can help us do that? Since the Buddha lived in Iron Age India some 2,400 years ago, maybe it's not surprising that we can't just go back to the texts and read off how it is that we should respond. But of course, there are a number of sort of implications built into the teachings. And what I'd like to do this evening is to focus on one of them in particular, which is the Bodhisattva Path, or as I prefer to say, the new Bodhisattva Path, because I think in some ways we need to update it or understand it in a somewhat new way. And what I'd like to focus on in particular are what stand out for me as the three aspects of the Bodhisattva Path that really need to be emphasized. So that's what I want to talk about. 1, 2, 3. But let me do a reality first, a reality check first. Can everyone hear me okay? How's the sound? Everything all right? Great, great. Okay. So the first aspect of the Bodhisattva path, and maybe it's kind of obvious, but I don't know that the implications are really understood. Bodhisattvas have a double practice, right? That is to say, they don't just focus on their own awakening. They don't just meditate or whatever their contemplation practice may be, but they also realize that it's important to be engaged in the world. Obvious? Well, I remember Bob Thurman, something he likes to say, you know, practice, practice, practice. Everyone's talking about practice. What I want to know is, when is the performance? Is it possible that the performance is part of the practice, right? I think something we easily fall into is the idea that somehow real practice is what we're doing when we're sitting on our cushions or working on our koans, and sort of engagement otherwise is a kind of distraction. And it may be it's a necessary distraction at some times, but fundamentally it's a kind of a distraction. And I think what we're moving toward is the realization that that kind of duality just doesn't apply, right? One of my all-time favorite quotations by the Indian teacher Nisargadatta sort of points to this. He famously said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows." Beautiful. The two pillars of the Buddhist path, right? Wisdom and love, or as we say, wisdom and compassion. And what I so much love about that quotation is that it implies so much the relationship between the two, right? If wisdom is the realization that I'm nothing, that there's no me separate from the world, then the love is the way of being. It's not just a feeling, it's the way of being. The compassion is the way of being in the world that embodies and actualizes that realization. Franz Kafka said something pointing in the same direction. In one of his letters, he said, "You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That's something you're free to do. But perhaps your holding back is the one suffering you could avoid." Let me say that again, because I like it so much. You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world, but perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering you could avoid. When we start our practice, you know, almost always it's because there's some dukkha, there's some suffering, there's some problem, discomfort in our lives. It may be physical, psychological pain, or it might be a kind of existential angst about, you know, what's it all about. But inevitably, I think there's a kind of self-preoccupation there that brings us to the practice. But as we practice, what we eventually realize is that at the heart of our dukkha, at the heart of our suffering, is this delusion of separation, the delusion that I'm separate from you, the delusion, therefore, that somehow my well-being is separate from your well-being. And that therefore, I mean, when we realize that, what does it mean in terms of how we engage with the world? I'm thinking back in the days when I started Zen practice in the early 70s in Maui Zendo. We sat pretty hard, on average 4 hours a day, plus we had zazenkai, sesshin, and so forth. And to be frank, it wasn't that difficult or that rare to have some kind of opening, some kind of insights or experiences. But what I found, and I think I wasn't the only one, is that whereas the experiences seemed to sort of happen pretty naturally, what was much more challenging was to actually integrate the realizations into how I actually related to other people. I think somehow many of us have a kind of romanticized notion about practice. Certainly I did in those days. we think of somebody like Milarepa in his cave. You go in a cave and you eat nettles or whatever, and 40 years later, you emerge as as somebody who's fully enlightened. And frankly, I don't think it works like that. As Joanna Macy said, the world has a role to play in our awakening, which means then that the kind of, how to say it, the person who benefits most from the engaged activity of the Bodhisattva is the Bodhisattva herself. Once we realize, and therefore it's important to realize that that engagement is part of how our usual sort of self-preoccupied, deeply habituated, self-centered tendencies, right? Looking out for number one, what's in it for me? What's going to promote my well-being? Just because we have some insights, some moments of opening, it doesn't mean that those habits disappear. The challenge in integrating is transforming those habits, living in a way that's more engaged, that's responding appropriately to the dukkha that we find that we are more aware of in the world, right? So I think rather than understanding the Bodhisattva path as like, there's somebody who could mythologically has some great awakening, but they choose to sort of stick around and help the rest of us. I think that way of looking at it is a really misconception of the kind of transformation and how it is that transformation happens on this path. Our engagement, our non-dual, non-selfish engagement with other people, with the world, is an essential part of our practice, right? So that's the first thing about the Bodhisattva path that stands out, I think. The second one, and this is why I sometimes want to talk about this as a kind of new Bodhisattva path, is a deeper understanding of dukkha, or suffering in the broad sense, right? Where the suffering comes from and how it is that we can address it, right? When we look at sort of traditional Buddhism, the way that Buddhism has been taught throughout pretty much all of Asia, as I understand it, my dukkha is due to my karma. It's due to the way my mind works and what I've done in my past lifetimes. There's a very kind of individualistic understanding. I'm not sure that the Buddha thought that way. I mean, when we go back to the Pali Canon and look at his attitude toward women and toward caste, it suggests to me, frankly, that he was a lot more progressive than the institution that developed after he died, right? I mean, it was a really radical thing to create a bhikkhuni sangha, a sangha for female monastics, based on the realization that they have the same Buddha nature, the same potential to awaken as men do. And likewise, his attitude toward caste. Once you join the sangha, you lose caste. In fact, you're not even supposed to talk about caste. And there are Pali Canon sutras, such as the Aganya Sutra, where it's very clear the Buddha understands society, social relationships as a kind of construct, a collective construct. It's not inevitable. He sees this is how we choose to live together, with the potential, of course, that we can transform that. The reason I emphasize this is because the traditional way of talking about suffering fits very nicely into the usual way of understanding the Bodhisattva path, right? It's like it's individuals helping other individuals. And in this way, I think we've probably come a long way in the last, at least in my lifetime, in, say, American Zen, where I think it's now generally accepted that it can be really beneficial to me as well as to others if I engage in activities that help homeless people, maybe a soup kitchen or something, or prison dharma, or hospice work. But when it comes to the larger issues of social structure, of what it is, where it is that the dukkha comes from, that I think is still a bit of a stumbling block and a challenge for us Buddhists, right? What am I getting at here? I once heard a Buddhist teacher reflect, and that teacher will remain nameless. Oh, what terrible karma all those Jews in Nazi Germany must have had to be born at that time in that place. And I remember thinking, this is unacceptable, you know. I can understand how it follows from the tradition, you know, it must be their own karma, it must be, but look, blaming the victim, that's just no longer acceptable. We know too much about how social forces can work, how even wonderful people, the most wonderful people, can get caught up by the larger social movements that can be so destructive. And we, therefore, I think part of the challenge today in these incredible times is expanding our understanding of the dukkha that Buddha addresses away from individuals to look at more institutional, structural, social forces of that cause dukkha, right? As I sometimes say, we've become better, I think, in the last generation or so, pulling drowning people out of the river. But what's also needed is we need to find ways to ask, well, why are there so many more drowning people in the river these days? Who or what is pushing them in upstream? We really need to ask these deeper questions. And I can understand why we hesitate to do that, why it's difficult, because it basically involves a kind of conceptualizing that we otherwise do not encourage in our Zen practice, right? If I'm meeting a homeless person, it's immediate, and it can be very clear what the appropriate response is. If you have an economic system that is by far the wealthiest and the most powerful in the history of humanity, but you also have an incredible number of homeless people or an incredible number of people in prison, those issues are harder to grapple with. But nonetheless, I think we cannot avoid asking the questions about social dukkha or institutionalized dukkha. One of the ways I sometimes talk about that is in terms of the three poisons, right? The Buddha didn't talk about evil in an Abrahamic sense, right? But what he said was basically, when what we do is motivated by one of the three poisons, greed, ill will, delusion, then it tends to create problems that are going to be difficult to solve, or it'll create situations that become problematical. And I think we need to realize the sense in which today those three poisons have become institutionalized. I think we have to accept that if greed, for example, means you never have enough, well, that's a pretty good description of our economic system, not only for consumers who never consume enough and are taught to find the meaning of their lives in that, but also, you know, a corporate form of capitalism whereby corporations are never profitable enough, their market share is never big enough, their stock price is never big enough, collective GDP is never big enough, right? But why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? If that's not a definition of greed, I don't know what is. And likewise with collective ill will. I mean, there's a lot of things to focus on. And in particular, obviously in the last few weeks, racism. The cancer of racism, which has always been there, it's just become that much more exposed. But there's other things as well. We could look at our militarism, the fact that if we measure it by the amount of resources that we devote to it, the United States is by far the most militarized society in human history. And the additional problem there, of course, is that if you spend that much money on your military, well, you're going to have to fight wars once in a while. You're going to have to find or create enemies. But then again, if you're greedy, maybe those aren't hard to create. Institutionalized delusion, well, we're all too familiar these days with fake news. But even before that, remembering that the media in this country are for the most part private, that is to say corporations, and you know, they're into making money, and they don't do it by educating and informing us. What they do is they find ways to grab our eyeballs and sell them to the highest bidder, which is to say advertising, which of course encourages this kind of consumerism that is so, I mean, if you really look at the meaning, how to say it, if some aliens in spaceships were sort of watching us and they couldn't understand our languages, but they just looked and observed what we were actually doing, I think it would be hard for them to decide otherwise than that, you know, the real meaning of our civilization is consumption and growth. And we're at a situation now when it's very clear that is a fundamental problem that we all have to face. Anyway, I hope you can see where I'm going here, that today, when we look at the dukkha, that's always been the focus of Buddhism. The Buddha said all he had to teach was dukkha, suffering in the broad sense, and how to end it. And the Four Noble Truths, all about dukkha, cause of dukkha, end of dukkha, Eightfold Path to end dukkha. Buddhism is all about dukkha, understanding it, putting an end to it, reducing it. And today, I think it's very clear we have to have a broader understanding and engage with the institutional causes of dukkha, as well as continuing to help people one-on-one. So that's the second aspect of the Bodhisattva Path, but in a way, it's the third one that really I want to emphasize the most, which is to say that the Bodhisattva Path doesn't teach us what to do, but it teaches us how to do it. And of course, that makes a lot of sense, right? If the Buddha lived 2,400 years ago in India, and if all of the Asian Buddhist traditions are pre-modern, we can't simply read off from them the solutions to the very particular kinds of problems we have today, right? We have to use our own best judgment. And you know, of course, we can see a variety of things that people do and that need to be done. One of my friends here in Boulder is a retired banker who goes to Washington and lobbies for a carbon tax, right? Citizens Climate Lobby. Another friend very good at helping my wife and I reduce our carbon footprint when we bought this home here just outside Boulder. Solar panels and all that sort of thing. Some of us are more engaged. I have a bit of a history as a sort of nonviolent activist back in the Vietnam era. So, you know, I'm interested in things like Extinction Rebellion, direct action, nonviolent civil disobedience, which in certain cases might be very helpful. Okay, which of those is which of those is a Buddhist appropriate response? And I would say all of them, and no doubt many more as well. But what I want to finish by focusing on, I'm going to spend a few minutes on this, is what it is then that we can especially learn from what the Bodhisattva Path tells us about how to do what we do. I mean, there are certain obvious things you can read off in the literature. You can talk about the 6 paramitas, the 6 sort of perfections, you know, generosity. I'm going to have to check them, right? Generosity, ethical behavior, patience or endurance, determination, meditation or mindfulness, and finally prajna or wisdom. That material is there, but rather than rehearse it, what I want to talk about are a couple things that really sort of stand out in particular for me. One of them goes back to the fact that I mentioned earlier, that Buddhism doesn't focus on this duality between good and evil, which is much more Abrahamic, right? For Buddhism, insofar as there's a duality, it's a duality between delusion and wisdom, or ignorance and awakening. And built into that, therefore, is the idea that when we're engaged in some kind of engaged social activity, that it's not about sort of us versus them. It's not about identifying the bad people and defeating or destroying them. But the fundamental idea is that it is an activism based on love, not on hatred, not basically on anger, but on love, and based on the realizations that there's this great web of delusion that, you know, we're all a part of, and that even people working against us who may, you know, it may be necessary to stop them, but that doesn't deny their Buddha nature. That doesn't deny that they, it doesn't demean them. I'm thinking of somebody like Gandhi, who, having been educated in India, you know, he had a great deal of respect for the English people, the British people. He didn't despise them or denigrate them, but he simply said, look, there's so few of you and so many of us, sooner or later you have to leave. And they did. And likewise, I think it's really important. It's one of the fundamental Buddhist principles that I think we need to keep in mind in our engagement, not to vilify the people that we understand to be working against us, or as the Christians sometimes say, distinguish the sin from the sinner. There's another aspect that I think is really important. Well, a couple more, but one that I especially like talking about, the Buddha's emphasis on pragmatism and non-dogmatism, which is really so important to help avoid, when we think about engagement, to avoid becoming sort of too preoccupied with the sort of perfect social analysis. One of the things I love about the teachings of the Buddha is the way that he emphasized his Dharma is a raft to help us across the river of life and death to the other shore. And when we get to that other shore, we don't say, oh, what a wonderful raft that's been. I'm going to carry it around on my back everywhere I go. I mean, that's fantastic. What's he basically saying? You know, the raft is heuristic. Buddhist teachings are not sacred scriptures. They are like roadmaps or guidebooks to help us go somewhere. And there's no point in sort of putting them in an altar and bowing down to them or calling ourselves a Buddhist if we don't attempt to follow that roadmap, if we don't attempt to transform ourselves, right? So I see that as encouraging very much a kind of skillful means that doesn't get stuck on particular doctrinal things, but is flexible according to the situations, which is clearly the kind of thing that we need. But anyway, let me turn to what for me is the most interesting aspect of this whole talk this evening, and what I think is most distinctive and powerful about the Bodhisattva Path or spiritual activism, because it's not just found in Buddhism. Bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of their actions. Bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of their actions. The Buddha actually says somewhere in the Pali Canon that one characteristic of an awakened person is that their actions are nirasa. Can be translated different ways, without expectation or even without hope. This principle is not, as I said, distinctively Buddhist or only Buddhist, because it immediately reminds me anyway of the Bhagavad Gita, that most sacred text of Hinduism, which talks about this as karma yoga, the path to God that involves action. But the emphasis is action, again, without attachment to the results. To quote the Bhagavad Gita, it says, "Your right is to the work, never to the fruits. Be neither motivated by the fruits of action nor inclined to give up action." But still, non-attachment to the results, I think, is kind of tricky because it's easy to misunderstand it. It can be understood to encourage a kind of such a complete focus on our motivation that we lose sight of results. And I don't think that's what it means at all. We still need to think strategically about what it is we do and what we would like to be accomplished. Because there's so much emphasis on Buddhism on motivation, on our intention, we can sort of focus on that and say, as long as my motivations are pure, it doesn't matter if anything happens. And I think that's really fatal in terms of the kind of engagement that's needed today. So what I'd like to do is finish by drawing out what I think are for me, three important aspects of this non-attachment to results. The first is, please consider the difference between running a 100-meter dash and a marathon. when you run a 100-meter dash, there's no time to think about anything else except the goal. Everything is just to get there as quickly as possible. But needless to say, you can't run a marathon that way, right? Because you're going to burn yourself out really quickly. In order to run a marathon, you have to pace yourself. And even though you are running in a certain direction, you know, you're not sitting by the side of the road, even though you're running, or I should say, because you're running in a certain direction, and you don't have to worry about that direction, assuming the path is well marked, because you're running in that direction, the focus can be completely on the here and now. Just this step, just this step, just this step. In Japanese, we have a term for it, tada, right? Just this. If you run in the right direction, you will eventually get there. But in the process, you need to focus on what's happening right now, because in that you are doing what's necessary to get to that end point. And it's interesting here, I personally haven't run a marathon, but I have some Zen friends who have, and it's interesting what they say is when you do this, you can get into sometimes a state, you know, the runner's high, or what the Taoism talks about wei wu wei, the action of non-action. You can literally, in becoming one with your body, sort of have a sense of effortlessness, even as you're running, a sense of the body is sort of running by itself. But that won't be possible if you're constantly focusing on, I've got to get there, I've got to get there, I've got to get there. So in our activism, you know, the encouragement here is to focus on the here and now, right? But there's a lot more to say, I think, about non-attachment to results, right? A marathon's a long race, but you know, sooner or later you're going to get to the end, even if you're walking, right? What is it, 26 miles maybe? What about a path with no end, or a task so difficult that it may be difficult not to become discouraged because it's so difficult to accomplish? Like maybe saving all sentient beings in the universe, however we understand that. What I'm thinking about now, of course, is the 4 Bodhisattva Vows, which I'm sure all or almost all of you have recited many times. We do it every day in the Zendo, more often in Sesshin. The first vow is to help all living beings awaken, right? Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them all. If we really understand what this commitment involves, can we really avoid feeling overwhelmed? We're vowing to do something that cannot be achieved. We're vowing to do something impossible, which is actually not the problem, but the point, right? The point of the Bodhisattva Path is not to get to the point where it's accomplished, but rather a reorientation in the meaning of one's life, away from our usual self-preoccupation and the habits that support that, to primary concern for the well-being of everyone, and indeed for the earth as a whole. And you can see how this connects with what I said earlier about how our path, how deeply embedded this is in how important this is in our larger spiritual transformation, right? On the day-to-day level, what's important is not the unattainable goal, but the direction, which orients us without providing any endpoint. And it's interesting if you think about that in terms of the, say, eco-crisis. Supposing, I mean, if we really study the eco-crisis, it's pretty difficult not to be discouraged sometime. I mean, it looks bad. Anybody else following what's going on in northern Siberia the last week or two? You know, it's serious. But here's the point. Someone who has taken the Bodhisattva vows, who's basically volunteered for a job that's literally impossible, is not going to be discouraged or intimidated by challenges that sometimes appear hopeless. No matter how momentous the task may be to work with others, maybe in this case, we can say to save global civilization from destroying itself. In a way, that's kind of a subset of what the Bodhisattva has vowed to do. The point being, no matter what happens, we're not discouraged, right? or maybe not for long. I mean, we'll take a few breaths, but then we dust ourselves off and get on with it. Because this vow goes beyond attachment to any particular accomplishment or defeat. Again, we're talking about a different way of being in the world. When our efforts are successful, hey, that's great. And then just, there's always more to do. If our efforts aren't successful, well, pick ourselves up, keep trying, or maybe it's more appropriate to shift on to something else. Once we realize our non-duality with other people, with people of other races, once we realize, including in this, right, our white privilege, that we live in a culture of white superiority, right, and how important it is for us to do what we can to address that. Once we really realize this, we don't want to do anything else. This way of living in the world becomes our passion and our joy. So that to me is a second aspect of the non-attachment to results, because no result is in a way sufficient. But that's not the most important. For me, the deepest meaning how to say it. Let's go back to the ecological. As I said, if we really understand the ecological situation, if we try to follow, it's discouraging because it looks very difficult. There is the very real chance that our efforts will be in vain. Scientists talk, there's a certain number of tipping points, and it seems like we're very close, or maybe we've even surpassed a number of them, right? It's difficult to anticipate what's going to happen, but it doesn't look good. The truth is, we just don't know. We just don't know. We don't know what's happening. We don't know what's possible. Just don't know. Just don't know. Just don't know. Well, wait a minute. Zen. Does that sound familiar? In the Zen world, isn't that something that our Zen practice cultivates? Don't know mind, rather than this not knowing as something that paralyzes us, which it can. I think in a way, in our practice, we embrace don't know mind. As we know, it's the first tenet of Zen peacemakers. And one of my teachers in Hawaii, Robert Aiken, he liked to say that our task isn't about clearing up the mystery, it's making the mystery clear. The spiritual path isn't about coming to understand everything. Oh, now I know how everything works, but opening up to a sort of fundamental mystery, sacred and mysterious world where everything is changing whether we know it or not. And bodhisattvas access this mystery, not by grasping it, as I said, but somehow opening up to it and being taken by it. And therefore we find that we're manifesting something deeper than our egos, right? So what I'm saying is that for those of us on the path, this awesome mystery and don't know isn't debilitating, but it's actually empowering. Partly because it liberates us from dogmatism. But here's the point. We continue to do the best we can in response to the best we know, although we never know for sure what's happening or what's possible, right? I'm not talking here about optimism or even, and this is really important, I think, I'm not talking about hope. Optimism, pessimism, there's a classic sort of conceptual duality where each term is dependent on the other. My favorite definition of a pessimist is someone who has had to live with an optimist. And in a way, the same thing is with hope. If you are motivated by hope, you're also going to be haunted by despair. You're going to be shadowed by despair. And I think the motivation of the Bodhisattva is deeper than both, right? Václav Havel sort of redefines hope when he says, Havel was the, president, I think, of the Czech Republic. He said, quote, Hope isn't the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing regardless of how it turns out. And Wendell Berry, the great American writer, said something very similar, quote, "We don't have the right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what is the right thing for us to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it?" I don't know if there's any Lord of the Rings fans here, Tolkien fans. There's a passage, I think it's in the first part of the trilogy, where Frodo says, "I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us." And yet Joanna Macy says just the opposite. She said she wouldn't miss this time for anything, that this is the most wonderful time because this really challenges us to be the most alive. It challenges us to bring forth the best that's within us in response. So which is it? Is it Gandalf? Is it Joanna Macy? Is it in some sense both? Anyway, this points for me to the deepest meaning of non-attachment to results, which is simply this. Our task is to do the very best we can. I mean, we need to think strategically. We aim at results. Our task is to do the very best we can, not knowing what the consequences will be, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever. And I'm going to repeat that because I think that's the most important thing for me anyway that I can say this evening. Our task, we are challenged to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do is going to make any difference whatsoever. Have we already passed tipping points? And civilization as we know it is doomed? We don't know. And that's okay. Of course, we hope our efforts will bear fruit, right? We try to be strategic, as I keep saying, but ultimately, especially when we're talking now about the earth, ultimately our efforts are our gift to the earth, right? And like every real gift, you don't give a gift in the expectation of something in return. A gift is given freely. We do it because it's the right thing to do. We don't know if what we do is important, but we do know that it's important for us to do it. I'm reminded again, and from a different spiritual tradition, right? Judaism, with Rabbi Tarfon, who said famously, "Don't be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Act justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. It is not your responsibility to finish the work of Tikkun Olam, healing the world, but you are not free to desist from it either." Judaism too. I think this is really the heart of the issue. And of course, to act completely without attachment to results, of course, that's very difficult. And I think we have to expect to be disappointed sometimes and frustrated, depressed when things don't work out as we were working. But I think that's okay. We're not expected here to be perfect. Our job is to do the very best we can. What's interesting, of course, is how this connects with what I was talking about at the very beginning. I think it's very hard to act without non-attachment to results unless we are grounded, unless our activism, our engagement is grounded in some kind of spiritual practice, such as Zazen, such as our Zen path, because it's that grounding that can enable us to do the very best we can, but also be able to nonetheless find our equanimity, our serenity when things don't work out. And so please don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying that results aren't important. in a way, what I'm trying to focus on is simply an acceptance of the fact how when it doesn't work out the way that we would like it to work out, that what should be our attitude as spiritual practitioners. Frankly, it seems to me that if Buddhists today don't want to do this or can't do this, if they can't relate to the world in the way that I think this new Bodhisattva path implies, frankly, it seems to me then that if Buddhists can't or don't want to do this, then Buddhism really isn't what the world needs today. But in fact, I think it's just the opposite, that I think Buddhism, as I've tried to show in this talk, I think embedded within this Bodhisattva path, I think it may be exactly what the world needs. And this may be what's distinctive about the Buddhist contribution, this emphasis on the double practice, which enables us to do the very best we can without attachment to results. Thank you.
Well, David, if I may just thank you very, very much for that most brilliant talk. Very, very incisive to this very moment we're in, and actually unleashing some, well, something like hope or something very encouraging out of the meeting of the times as they are to our practice, being absolutely, really very, very, as you say, appropriate. I mean, to one another almost. So the times are ones in which the very qualities or attributes and parameters indeed that we're cultivating are absolutely right for the times, so to speak. So that's very, very, as a wonderful, thank you. Wonderful way to look at it. Please, and I would like on that note, actually, please everybody, let's not forget, the first parameter, dharna. David actually is, running a very wonderful center up in Boulder. I was lucky enough, or near Boulder, lucky enough to be shown around it by David back, it must be a couple of years ago now. Soon after, I think you were sort of beginning to get it running. The Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center. I think I got it. Yeah.
Yep, you got it. Yeah, we've come a long way since you visited us, Henry. We hope you can come back again and take a look, or even maybe once all this settles, if and when, if you ever wanted to do a retreat up there, that might be possible to arrange too.
Oh, wow, that's a very, very, very wonderful thought. Thank you so much. Well, let's see, yes, and when everything settles. But meanwhile, please don't forget that center and of course, David's many efforts deeply merit our support. So please use the link that Peg or Johanna rather gave us. Thank you very much. So, well, David, thank you again, and thank you, Johanna, and thank you, Peg. And I'll hand it back to, I guess, Peg, to you.